squadron commander. I just want to know what the training was like back then. If you could just maybe describe a day of training, how tough it was, you know, how often were you in an airplane, how often were you doing PT, stuff like that?
If you didn't hear that, you're probably better off. A friend of mine and I went to the Air Force out of high school. There was people being drafted to go into the service, and right out of high school, and you had no control over where you went, so we wanted to go to the Air Force, we wanted to fly. And at that time, we were sent, we signed up and took tests and so on. 1 week after graduation from high school, we went to Biloxi, Mississippi for basic training. Took the basic training, and at that point there was a test they called the Stanine score. It was something like the IQ test of today, supposedly designed to determine what branch of the service or what duties of the service you were most apt to succeed at. And we were separated at that point. Fortunately for me, I was sent to pilot training school, and Tuskegee, Alabama was our entry into that. We went to primary training that was flying the Stearman PT-17. You guys being interested in aviation, you probably know that aircraft. It's a biplane, fabric covered, very sturdy one. And it had to be sturdy because we crashed a lot of them into the ground, called it landings. You had 8 hours to solo, and if you did not succeed in 8 hours, you were washed out and sent to some other branch of the service. I was lucky enough I made it to out of that 8 hours. The pilot, Charles Johnson, as a matter of fact, the instructor, when you gotten to the point that he thought you could get the thing up and down 3 times by yourself, you would just crawl out of the plane at the end of the runway and say, okay, go kill yourself. Although there was another word in between we won't get into. And the next area was basic training. That was the first area, Molten Field, is associated with Tuskegee Institute. Now it's Tuskegee University. Then you went to the Air Force Base, Army Air Force Base, as it was in those days, at Tuskegee. It's now just a flat field with some old runways that are overgrown with vegetation, and privately owned by some guy who was a farmer. But you went there and they did the rest of your training at Tuskegee Air Force Base. We did the basic training in Vaulty Vibrator, we called it. I've forgotten the designation. It was a higher powered aircraft, low wing monoplane, and it had fixed gear. And then from that you went to the AT-6, the famous Texan. And finally there was a BT-17 or something like that, a tail dragger that was used for twin engine training. We came along and they started using B-25s for twin engine training, which at the time was still a tactical aircraft, and we thought we were the greatest things in the world. All along the way, people were being washed out because you had to meet these various requirements, and you were tested regularly. 2/3 of everyone who went into pilot training, they were washed out wherever you were. If you got to the end of the training and got your wings, you thought you were the hottest thing going. We, after that, went into, let's see, what did we do after that? 87 years, by the way, that's us too. The war was over by the time I got my wings, so we didn't have to go overseas. And to cut this a little bit shorter, I'm riding on the tails of the guys that get all the fame for being Tuskegee Airmen, the 99th and the 332nd, and fought over Europe and Italy and North Africa. I did all my fighting in town over Mississippi, Alabama, and places like that. But nonetheless, we are trying to continue to perpetuate the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen, what they stood for, what they went through, and that's part of the reason why we're here today. Captain. It's on you.
As it was said before, I entered the service and as a private in the anti-aircraft artillery, and naive enough to believe that maybe I would get to go to OCS and become a second lieutenant. But at the time that I went in, the OCS, Officers Candidate School, was closing down, and they were very limited as to how many soldiers they were taking into to become officers. One of the lieutenants in our battalion suggested that I might want to consider the Air Force, the Air Corps at the time. And since the Air Corps was part of the Army, it was quite easy to transfer from one to the other, which I did. And as Wilk said, Keesler Field was the first stopping off point where you had to prove yourself to you had to prove yourself that you could be either bombardier, navigator, or pilot. And from there, I went to Tuskegee. Initially, all the my class had bombardiers, navigators, and pilots. We all went through the same basic training. After basic, or primary was, then we split up. The pilots stayed and went to Moulton Field, and those of us who were going to be either navigators or bombardiers, we had to wait until there was an opening at one of the schools for those two disciplines. At that point, they did not have a bomber group for black students, so we had to wait. Eventually, I did get to Midland Field, Texas, where I earned my wings as a bombardier, and then back to Tuskegee, and I was assigned to the 477th Bomber Group, which was in its infant stages. And since we really didn't have too much to do and the war was fading out, we were sent. Some of us were sent to Tuskegee for pilot training. And as Will said, if you didn't get through solo, you were out. I did manage to solo. I could take the plane up, I could bring it back down, I could maneuver it up, but I couldn't do any of the fancy maneuvers as well as they wanted to do. And here again, I had never even driven a car. So I had no idea what it took to actually do things, and I was up there, and when I did solo, the Chief Anderson said, "All right, go on up there," and he said, "Kill your fool self." I said, "Okay, that's what I'll do." And so I went up and soloed and stayed up there a little longer than I should, just to show him that I could fly it. And then I brought it back down and went through a puddle of water and splashed on it. The field there was a grass field. In fact, it's still a grass field. I was down there a few years ago. My former wife, she had roots down there. Some of her family were from Tuskegee, so they had their reunion down in Tuskegee, and so I got a chance to go out to Moulton Field, and it hadn't changed a heck of a lot over the 40 or more years. But I went, as I said, the war ended, and the war was coming to an end, and we were sent to Louisiana, Monroe, Louisiana, for navigation training. And that didn't work out too well because the war ended and everybody was going home at that point. So in September of '45, I was mustered out of the service and into the active reserve and sent home, and I went back to school. And that's my story. I got married along the way. It didn't work out too well first time. So I tried it the second time, and that worked out pretty good. And that's the end.
Was it an option for you to stay in the service a bit longer if you wanted to, or when the war was over, that was it? They turned everybody loose?
I'm not sure. At that time, I was interested in going back home and going back to school, because before I went into service, I spent one semester at Illinois Tech, and I was working during the day and going to school at night. So I had invested some of my own money at that point in schooling, so I thought I'd want to continue there.
Luke, how about you?
How's that?
No, it was not. Well, I went in under the AUS, the Army of the United States it was, which was a temporary organization in the beginning. And once the war was over, even though that they'd spent all that money in the training and so forth, there was no need for us. So they sent me to Lockmore Army Air Base, which is outside of Columbus, Ohio, where I became officers club manager and also a lifeguard for the pool. Couldn't swim very well, but I was the lifeguard. Shows you how it works in the service, but you'll find out. And if I had had the opportunity, I would have stayed there. I would certainly have stayed there, because I couldn't afford to fly in civilian life. And then after having had that training, I figured, well, I'll get out and I'll try to get a job in commercial aviation. And that didn't pan either, because they weren't hiring blacks at that time. By the time that they did start to hire blacks, I was too old. So I became a bus driver and all those other things that I mentioned before. So yes, I would have stayed if I could have, but I wasn't able to.
Well, it looks like this movie